All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on this webinar. And if for those of you that don't know me, I'm Sylvain Fontaine, technical specialist here at IT Cloud. My solution area is modern work and security. So welcome to this session one of our security excellence program, where we're going to cover some of the tools that Microsoft provides to us that are available, I should say, uh, security relative wise, so we can help your customers on their security journey and to reach that destination of a more secure security posture. We'll look a little bit at how we're going to proceed today. So we're going to look at the threat landscape briefing to look at what some of the most pertinent cybersecurity risks or dangers are at the moment. We're going to also look at typically how security teams deal with security incidents on a daily basis. And then we're going to look at how we can transform those security operations using a unified platform. Now, today, our main focus in security solutions is going to be on identity and access management, and we're going to look as well at device management. And then we'll close and we'll talk about the next steps, which we'll see what we're going to cover in session two when we meet again. So Microsoft tells us that on a daily basis, they gather more than 78 trillion security signals per day, those coming from over 300 unique state and financial crime actors. So we know that cyber threats are out there. They're prevalent, they're relative. I mean, they're real. I don't think anyone can say that there's anything fake about cybersecurity threats. Now, those top three trends, translate into those nation state threats or actors, were the ones that they've actually developed an expertise. And instead of them actually, doing the cyber crimes that are hacking themselves, what they do is they make their services available. So they resell their knowledge and make themselves available to other people that would like to hire them or hire their cyber attack solutions in order to try to, circumvent security systems and benefit financially from victims. Now, ransomware is evolving to target unmanaged devices, and we'll look at what the difference is between an unmanaged device and a managed device. And we'll look as well, with the advent of AI. Yes, artificial intelligence is a very interesting, tool to increase productivity. But unfortunately, there's always some people that will choose to use, intellectual or technological advancements in a negative way. Now, this I pulled from Microsoft's most recent security report, where they talk that organizations with ransom-linked encounters continues to increase while the percentage of those ransomed is decreasing. And the reason why it has been decreasing, it's because of automatic attack disruption. Now, obviously, you have to have a solution in place that permits you to have that functionality. And we're going to look at some of those solutions from Microsoft that actually permit us to have that capability of automatic attack disruption. Now, it's all good and fine that people aren't actually ultimately getting their information encrypted, that they don't have to pay the ransomware. But the problem is that that's just the consequence of the action. It's not the actual cause, and the actual cause is that weakest link, which is the human being who ended up installing an application or clicking on a link, or submitting credentials where they shouldn't have, and then someone gained access to their device, their workstation, and then was able to, to come in and encrypt the data on it. Now, as I said before, generative AI is being employed by threat actors, unfortunately. So that generative artificial intelligence is used to generate more sophisticated malware, but it's also used to for vulnerability discoveries in systems. So they figure out how to, they can gain full access to systems. It's also able to customize, some of those generic exploits from the past. Now they're able to customize it depending on what they discover for vulnerabilities. Now they're able to come in and customize that and to try to further work around the security solutions that are already in place. Now we're going to talk about password cracking in instances where people use passwords that are much, much too easy to guess. And we'll see one solution that permits us to, to help us mitigate that problem. And as well, we have our phishing and social engineering, which unfortunately, once again, the weak link is the human behind the keyboard. And we're going to look at some solutions in session two as to how we can deal with phishing emails and social engineered emails, I should say. And as well, we'll look at malicious code that can exist in text or codes, executable codes inside of attachments, let's say, for example. So we'll look at some solutions that permit us to go and detect that malicious code and deal with it. And as well, command and control communication, well, obviously, they're, the whole idea behind that is if they have their identity, then they're definitely in control of your account and they're in command. So they get to control, in a sense that they can use your account to further spam other people, or as well send the emails, or even if they capture your voice, they can use AI, to create deep fakes. Now, we all know identities are a prime target for bad actors because the reality of today on the web, on the internet, is that anything that we need to access, we always have to provide credentials. We have to provide a login. So what happens in those cases is people will tend to reuse passwords that they use on other platforms. They will also tend to create easier passwords so that they can actually remember them. But the real problem is that some users will actually use their work ID, their work related username and password to connect to other platforms because that's something that they know that they use daily, that comes easy to them, that they don't need to remember or have difficulty remembering. So unfortunately, when those third-party platforms become compromised, then their identity, their organizational identities become compromised. So then we have to come and we have to, you know, come with our tool case and all our tools and our security features and try to circumvent the fact that that user's identity has been compromised. But ideally, if we could, teach users not to do that in the first place, obviously that would be our first line of defense. Now, new access security challenges are on the rise. Like I said, identity now is the key to everything because you need a username and a password to access a whole bunch of platforms. And sometimes, it might seem a little bizarre that some places where you want to access information will actually require you to create a login. Um, you know, so we need to adapt to this new reality of hybrid work. Now, the hybrid work is happening because, where a lot of people are remote working or hybrid working. So not everyone is just solely at the office anymore, or necessarily, they split their time between being on the road, being at the office, or some people are just fully remote. Now we have security gaps because some organizations are using so many different security solutions that we have what we call this siloed approach, and that each tool was developed and is there to deal with a specific threat, a specific need, but unfortunately, it's only able to address that need and it's not able to interact or to interconnect with any other solutions. And then we find, ourselves sort of being isolated, even though we have all these different security solutions that we're using in our environments. So that's part of the reason why we have these inconsistent and inefficient security controls. And because we're using all these different systems and they just don't talk to each other. So that's why we're also referring to these disjointed solutions, because not only are we spending a great amount of money acquiring them, we're spending a great amount of time learning them, we're spending a great amount of time configuring them, but unfortunately there are still just that individual solutions that we have to manage, configure, and deal with individually. So there's very rarely can you actually integrate third-party solutions one within another. Now, security teams, as I mentioned before, are forced to defend in silos. Now, what does that mean? Typically, the first avenue of compromise will usually be someone's email because, as I mentioned before, people will have the tendency to use their email alias, that username as a username, and they will also use the organizational credential, the password along with it, as that login for that third party platform. Or what they will do is they will get a phishing email and then it'll clicking on them, or it'll, someone, an unsolicited team invite or a team chat, prompting them to click on something. So it can either be coming in straight from email or through a collaborational platform. But at the end of the day, you know, what the um, what the cyber criminals want ultimately is to gain access to the system. So if they can get a user, to do through a credential harvest, if they can get a user to click on a link and then, hey, try this new functionality. The IT team has just put this in place. Of course, we all know it's a phishing scam, but the user doesn't. So what the user does is says, hey, I want to see this new function. I want to be part of part of the gang. I want to make sure that I have access to it as well. So, what did they do? They click on the link and they see that login window. And to them, it just looks like a normal login window. They don't see the difference that it doesn't quite look the same as their login window that they need to where they enter their credentials for their organizational access. So from that point on, their identity has been compromised. So, once that identity has been compromised, then I'm free to roam around to whatever the user has access to. And I can look at an information, and what usually they'll do is they'll try to see if they can't elevate their privileges, associate themselves a new role so they can have further access to the system or come in and change some parameters. But most of the time as well, they'll want to, they have access to the endpoint because now they've managed to, get that user to connect live on the spot. And as well, sometimes it'll say, oh, you need to install, this extension or this and that. And, the users, so, a lot of the times just don't really pay attention. And honestly, obviously we all know that they're not IT, so they might not necessarily pay full attention to what is going on. And they'll just go and click on it because they figured, hey, if the IT teams put this in place and it's telling me on the screen to do it, then I'm just going to go ahead and do it. But as well, we have other means of protecting our apps, and as well, we ultimately we're able to use our identity from our organization to gain access to other clouds or other apps that are not within our organization. So that's why that identity is very precious. We really, really need to protect those identities and secure those identities for users. And ultimately, what will happen is the hackers want access to your data. In the case of a ransomware, they basically want to encrypt, take a copy of all the data, then encrypt the copy that you're left with, and then you ultimately have to pay the ransom to get access to it. Or what will happen is it could be someone from a rival firm. Of course, this might be out of a spy novel, but ultimately, what will happen is that confidential or private data, it could be patents or formulas if you're into chemical engineering or pharmaceutical. So then we enter the realm of exfiltration of data. So Microsoft, through their investigations, report that some organizational, on average, will use up to 80 security tools. Now, I've actually never come across a case like that, but from talking to some of our partners, our resellers, I've actually had some tell me that they've got some clients or they have acquired new clients, and after taking inventory of the client's environment and everything that they were using, it's not necessarily, ultimately very rare, that they'll come across situations where there'll be 10, 15, and I've even heard a partner tell me that they had inventoried up to 20 different solutions used in that client's environment, to deal with security. Now, we say attackers think in graphs because once again, they're going to take advantage of that siloed approach because they know very well that their actions, within one silo, when they're in this environment, whatever they're doing here is recorded here, and it's not going to get reported necessarily to the identity and access management system. So once again, whatever they're doing in here, those alerts will stay in here. So because they don't have, those systems are not integrated, we don't have that correlation of data, so it becomes very hard to paint a picture or to know where that hacker came in, where he went to next, and potentially where they might end up or where they might want to go next. So that's why it's very important to have that integrated approach of our security solutions. And we say that the median time for an attacker to gain access to private data just from a phishing email is 72 minutes. I would even tend to guess that, perhaps with the use of AI, that they're able to analyze those environments even quicker. So I would actually, offer a guess that we might even be looking at less than 72 minutes in the future. Now, security teams need a force multiplier. So obviously, because attacks now happen in minutes instead of hours, and hours, I should say, relatively speaking, and not days or months anymore. Now, what we mean by that is it will happen that the attacker will gain access, but the attacker will remain in the system for days or months. But it didn't take them days or months to actually be able to find their way throughout the whole system. So the initial attack and where they actually gain access and are able to continue to propagate in the system really does take minutes and hours. And as I mentioned before, because we have all these individual solutions, yes, we do have security signals that are gathered from these solutions, but unfortunately, they're not correlated. There's no central analysis and there's no way to manage them centrally. So obviously attackers will take advantage of that because they know that it becomes very difficult, for us to pinpoint their steps or what they've done, or like I mentioned, potentially where they're going to go next. And then we say we don't have enough bandwidth to address risk exposure effectively. Well, that's because, obviously we all know the old adage is only 24 hours in a day, and that's definitely not enough. And typically we don't necessarily have enough personnel. And the other reality is the more solutions that we add to the mix, we're actually just making it worse. So Microsoft is using this principle of zero trust. Now, what is zero trust? It's when we're looking at it from the perspective that we should always assume breach, verify explicitly, and use least privileged access. So we should always assume that we're in a breach. In other words, we should always make sure that we're not uh, letting users or their identities, we're not letting them roam free, that we every time they want to access, they need to either provide credentials live at that moment or will use pre-existing credentials where uh, they've already authenticated to, through the identity system, Entra ID. And we talk as well about verify explicitly as well, that we're not going to necessarily take it for granted that they might still be on the same computer, let's say, for example. will also want to validate the device. Will also want to validate which apps they might want to access to. So that's where we need to have that multi-layered approach. And we should always think of the least privileged access. And we'll see a little bit later on a tool that permits us to do that, where we need to address that less privileged access, but we also need to address the fact that we need to provide access to people, but for the shortest amount of time that they need the access for. We don't want to leave that open ended. As some of us possibly do sometimes. Someone needs more access, so we just manually give it to them, but I forgot to make a note of it, or I forgot to rescind the access when I got back to work the next day, and then we end up having these accounts that have more access, more privileges than they should. So we'll look at our zero trust pillars. So we've already discussed identities. We've already discussed endpoints. We'll look at apps too in our second session, and what we can do about, yes, we can control access to apps. We'll see that today, but we can also control which apps are made available to people, more specifically cloud apps. We'll look at our infrastructure. We'll look at ways that we can modernize our infrastructure or adapt it or integrate it. We'll actually look at the concept of network. Now, in this case, we're not talking about local LAN or micro segmentation, even though that is a principle of zero trust with Microsoft, that they still believe in separate subnets, separate VLANs for categories of users. So that's still relevant today, even though we're mostly focused on the cloud. But good security practices in our hardware infrastructure and our local network is still important. But we're also going to look that network can be viewed in a different way now, because we have a new tool that's available in Entra ID, where we can actually categorize internet traffic, cloud traffic, and on-prem traffic, and we can use our Entra, our 365 ID or Entra ID username and password to gain access to these systems, but in a new different way, in this very secure way as well. And then we're going to look at data, and how can we protect our data? How can we protect access to the data? And how can we protect continued protection to the data even when it leaves our environment? And how can we protect exfiltration of data? Now, let's go back in time a little bit and look at our journey to the cloud, or some customers' journeys to the cloud. Now, years ago, when we all started in IT, of course, I'm speaking to myself, having a few gray hairs, that we started on-prem. And at that time, when we first started out, we weren't even thinking about, installing or configuring an antivirus on a workstation on the desktop. Well, as time went on, we started being more proactive. We started realizing that people could bring viruses into the workplace, on a USB drive, a USB key, a flash drive. So we started installing antivirus on our workstations. But then we told ourselves at first that, well, the workstation is secure. Then, if it lands on the workstation and it's secured, and I'm not worried about that file being copied to the shared drive on the network. But then we started realizing that, well, maybe we should, start thinking as well about installing antivirus on our servers. But the reality is, at first those solutions were really affected performance of the server operating system. So in some cases, we weren't always sure about committing to it, even though we understood the importance of security. But we had to weigh the pros and cons, the negative with the positive. So, but eventually, we started to adopt the fact that yes, we need an antivirus on our servers as well. But the reality is what was happening is we were installing product X on our workstation. Then we started installing product Y on our servers. Then we started using email servers. Well, once again, at first we didn't have email or anti-spam on our email servers, because at first it wasn't necessary. But eventually, it did become necessary. And lo and behold, what was happening? Well, we're installing another solution, another product, and product Z in this case. So we had three protection for three different reasons on three different types of systems, but once again, we're using three different systems that weren't integrated. So then we had to realize that, we needed to have device security or control, how our devices were being used. So when we had a local Active Directory domain controllers, then we're using GPOs. In some of the bigger organizations, the bigger environments where they had an IT team, they might even, go and use Configuration Manager. But then again, it all depends. Some places, weren't using GPOs or Configuration Manager, whereas some other places were. And then as well, when we're talking about restricting access to content, well, we were, at that time, we were satisfied with our file shares and our NTFS permissions. But the reality is when that file left the server, when it landed on the user's workstation, nothing was preventing the user from making a copy on a USB key, and nothing was preventing the user to make a copy, give it to somebody else, and keep a copy of it at home. Then we had some other customers, some other businesses that they got into business at a time where they just didn't have a need for an on-prem because they were very small. They had 2 or 3 employees, so they adopted the cloud-only model. So typically what happens in those scenarios is those users use those laptops or workstations, that they bought here and there, and it comes, they were fully satisfied because, hey, now Windows comes with an antivirus. So I'm just going to use the one that it comes with, even though it's what we call consumer based. Now those users, bought their 365 licenses. So as a base protection, they're entitled to use Exchange Online Protection, which comes with a 365 license. And then when we're talking about device management, well, in that case, that aspect is null because pretty much guaranteed that there is no device management going on. And as well, restricting access to content, or in this case, now we have tools where we can encrypt the content. We can even take that a step further. But, there again, generally speaking, people are not aware that it exists. So obviously, for that reason, they're not using it. But if they have, that 365 license, then their identity and access is being managed with Entra ID, meaning that when they connect to 365, they're authenticated, they have to prove who they are, and they're also authorized to access, different areas of the environment. Now we have the hybrid approach where we have some of these customers that started out on-prem and then they started adopting the cloud. Or I've seen some that started in the cloud, but then they grew, but they didn't look to the cloud to expand. They looked to add on-prem infrastructure for their expansion. So then we end up having the reverse. Instead of going from on-prem to cloud, they started in cloud and then started adding some on-prem. But then we still have that issue of uniformity where we have that mix of solution and that mix of approach. And I've even seen some other instances where organizations that are only in the cloud, but they have an office, and then they start going hybrid. And then all these new employees, what they tell them is, "Oh, don't worry about it. Just go buy a laptop, wherever you can, and we'll pay you back. And here's your username and password. Just log in and just install, Microsoft 365, your productivity suite, and you'll be good to go." Whereas the people that are on-prem, they're using the 365, but they've got a local antivirus because, there was the IT team is there on site on-prem. So they're a little more diligent. They also do device management. But so sometimes we have that double standard because we have two categories of users. Some of them are on-prem and some of them are now hybrid. And this is where Microsoft comes into play, where we're able to address that hybrid scenario. We're able to address the on-prem and we're able to address the cloud with the same security solutions. So now we have that harmonized approach where we're not only able to provide secure productivity, but we're also able to provide threat protection. And those security solutions are offered by a single vendor, centrally managed for on-prem and cloud infrastructures. So this will be the focus of our sessions, where we're going to look at all those solutions and how they actually lend themselves to a cloud scenario as well as an on-prem scenario. Now, obviously, when we have those separate solutions, we have that siloed approach. We have, rising technology costs, messy invoices, and it's a nightmare for IT management, and it just, makes everything more complex relative to security. So as I'm mentioning before, we have that perhaps we're using that default antivirus that came with Windows, and then we have the collaboration side of things. Then we have the email side of things, where we're going to deal with it differently. And then as well, device management. Well, depending on our scenario, or we might be doing it, we might not be doing it. Do we have a solution that will deal with phishing emails? Have our users been trained to recognize a phishing email? And then we have that data protection. Are we limiting access, or are we limiting propagation of data as well? And then we have the ransomware approach. Do we have the proper antivirus solution that will truly fully protect us from a ransomware? So as I mentioned before, this is where Microsoft comes into play, because not only with Microsoft do we have productivity and security, but we have it all in a package that we're provided with the tools that we need. We have comprehensive security, meaning that it encompasses, all our solution areas, productivity and security. And as well, we say that it's cost effective because it comes pre-packaged, and it's a lot more easier to acquire, to manage, to train on, and to transfer knowledge from employee to employee. You can also think of it this way. Training your present staff is one thing, but what about when you need to onboard new staff? So we say Microsoft 365 security, give us those solutions to secure your business. So as we mentioned before, comprehensive in the fact that we have our applications, we have our productivity apps, we have teams for collaboration, and we also have security. And of course, the licensing complexity is a lot simpler because, we need to provide the user one license, and then all associated security features, are made available, for that user, or the user benefits from all those security features. And in a lot of cases, some of those security features, don't require configuration. Yes, we can configure them if we want to elevate them, if we want to take it up a notch further, or if we have specific scenarios. But in some cases, we are able to get up and running quickly through this simplified deployment. As well, we save costs because, we're buying one solution. We assign that one license to the user instead of buying multiple security solutions. So we're simplifying and lowering our help desk overhead. And as well, we say enterprise grade security because Microsoft is now the largest security vendor, security, we'll say, firm in the world, with all their solutions and all the users that they're protecting at the moment. Here's a little graph showing some of those security solutions, and which pain points that they're able to address, and at what stage or at what process, through a customer's life or through a customer's use of their environment. So it's very all encompassing, very how should I say, very full. It's able to provide us, multiple solutions for multiple scenarios. Now, we say we need to modernize our identity infrastructure because, we have to keep evolving, to meet those security demands. Because as I mentioned before, on-prem security is very different than cloud security. And when we have that hybrid approach, we need to think of how to protect both of those environments at the same time. And ideally, we want to minimize the number of security solutions. We want to minimize the overhead. We want to make it simpler for our IT teams or for you, the MSP, when you're serving your customers. Make it easier on yourself than having to, address all these or deal with all these different solutions. And we'll look with in this session one, we're mostly going to concentrate on identity because once again, that's the door, that's the key to gaining access to all the organizational resources is now that single, username and password. So we'll see what solutions Microsoft are actually able to provide for us that permit us to increase that level of security and control access. So we're going to look at intra-private access. We'll look at internet access. Now, these two products are part of the same approach. They come in Entra Suite, but they're actually part of what's called Global Secure Access, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. We're going to look at ID governance. You might have some customers which are in that type of environment or activity where they need to produce reports, for it could be for regulatory reasons, it could be for legal reasons. We're also going to look at identity protection and what Microsoft does for us on the dark web relative to IDs. We're going to look at Microsoft Entra. We're going to look at verified ID, and that now we have options that people are now able to use to go passwordless. I mean, yes, there were other mechanisms in the past, but now we have an additional one that we can use. Now, Microsoft Entra ID is we call it a multi-cloud identity and access management because we're able to provide single sign-on to all apps. Obviously, all apps, by default, yes to 365, but we're also able to use that username and password to gain access to other apps outside of our 365 clouds. We can actually use that identity to access other cloud platforms. Now, multi-factor authentication, and we already talked about password, and I hope that all of your customers are using multi-factor MFA, that they're not only relying on a username and password, but I say that, and I know some still do. Some people still have a reluctance to add that extra authentication mechanism. And as well, we're going to use that. We're going to look at conditional access where we can add in that authentication procedure, we can add additional mechanisms, additional steps that the user has to go through. And I'll be honest with you, it's actually fully transparent to the user. The user doesn't know that these controls are in place. It doesn't know that these checks and balances are put in place and that this verification is actually taking place on their behalf. And we'll look at the continuous access evaluation in those conditional access. We'll also look at risk-based conditional access. So we can add extra features. We already talked about it a little bit, and that's that identity protection, where Microsoft monitors on the dark web, will monitor users' credentials, and we're actually able to use that once those credentials have been confirmed that they're compromised. Then we can take action in our conditional access policies, based on those risks. We can determine if we feel the need for the user to, that it requires them to provide more answers in a way before they're given access to the resources. We'll also talk about password reset, really talking about self-service password reset, and we'll see what that is. But when a user thinks that their identity has been compromised, then they're able to change their passwords themselves on their own whenever they feel the need. Obviously, if it happens at night or on the weekend and IT is not there, then if they suspect that this has happened, then you're better off to be proactive than reactive. So as soon as you suspect anything, you should definitely instruct those users to change their passwords. Now, formula for success, that zero trust user access. So we already talked about it that, through the use of conditional access, we're able to for all resources, whatever it is that they're trying to access using their identity, we can actually, beyond their identity, require that they use a certain type of device, a certain type of endpoint, and we can also limit them depending on which network they want to access. But we'll get back. We'll look at that a little bit later on what that notion of network is. We already talked about that, ensure least privileged access. We'll see a little bit later what that is through privileged identity management, improve the user experience. Now, the whole deal is that when we're able to, we'll say, harmonize or have one username and password on-prem and one the same username and password for the cloud, that's when we fall into a scenario where we're synchronizing our username and passwords from on-prem to the cloud. Then it helps users, that they only have that one ID to remember, and it also makes it easier when they're on-prem to access cloud resources. They don't necessarily have to re-authenticate. Now, because I mentioned before, we're able to use some of these cloud-based security solutions, but we're also able to use them not just for the cloud, but we're able to use them to manage and to secure some of these on-prem infrastructure as well. So migrating to Entra ID, why make the move? So Entra ID is really is becoming such an evolved product. There are features coming online constantly. It's improving all the time. Securing that access, making sure that people are given the right level of access, but also making sure that before they're given access, that they're able to prove to us who they are. As Microsoft, this is from Microsoft's latest report that just came out. And identity attacks, in perspective, password-based attacks continue to dominate, but can be thwarted by using strong authentication methods. So 99% of identity attacks are still using passwords. So that's where it becomes, important to use, all this passwordless approach. It permits us to use, a more complicated password, which is harder to crack. And as well, we can even make it so complicated that, practically impossible for a human to remember. And we only need to use it once. And that was the first time we authenticated. And then we configured our account for passwordless. And from that point on, we never enter that password again. Now let's look at Entra Password Protection. So this is that service that permits us to eliminate easy passwords. Now, what happens here is I put here way too easy company name, company products, or processes. And what I wanted to illustrate by that is that users will typically, try, take the easy way out, take the easy road, and that they'll use something that they can easily remember, that they don't necessarily have to force themselves to remember. But usually what happens is those passwords are just that. They are just way too easy. So what happens in that case is then the password can easily be cracked. And as well, what can happen, I've seen this in a few cases that, some people will actually use, part of the company name in their password. They'll actually use part of company products in the password. Or if they're working in a division, or they all need to authenticate for one reason because they're, working in a different branch of the business. They might even put, the name of the process that they work on that they need to authenticate to access. So this tool, permits us to create a list of banned passwords. And the beauty of this is we can actually extend this to on-prem to our Active Directory domain controllers. So we can establish that list in the cloud, and it gets pushed down to the domain controller, so that not only does it apply when the user is trying to change their password from their cloud access, but it also prevent the user from using that way too easy password when they're resetting their password when they're in the office. This is what I was talking about before with verified ID. We have now an additional method that we can now use face check, facial recognition through Entra ID to authenticate. So yes, at a basis, it's always that username and password, but then we can use Authenticator, we can use FIDO keys, we can use other mechanisms. But now face check has also been made available for those who wish to use it. Now, I mentioned before that, hopefully you'll have customers that are not just using a username and password and that they're using MFA. So, at its basis, Microsoft really is pushing hard, really wants to encourage people to use MFA and to use Microsoft Authenticator. But, there are other methods that we can use. I've seen others, some laptops will have that fingerprint scanner, and as well, we can use certificate-based authentication if we want to use sort of a Kerberos-based authentication, to the cloud. But we're also still able at the moment to use SMS and voice, but those push notifications, those one-time passwords. So there are really many other options, to add that extra method of authentication, or if you want to no longer use, just your password, you can go passwordless and use these other methods. So what's the challenge? The challenge is that employees need access to work data as they work from home or on the go. But bad actors might try to gain access to work information by stealing passwords, and then they'll gain access to that work data. In this case, we say from another country, because through conditional access policies, what we can do, we can actually block all authentication requests, let's say, that are not coming from Canada. So how do we could do that? We'll configure our conditional access policy to block every authentication request, but exclude Canada. So in other words, we're only going to permit authentication requests from Canada. But we can take that even a step further, and I've seen partners that do that with their customers. It does happen that you'll have customers that don't have a local infrastructure other than just those desktop machines and a switch in a closet and their internet router. They're basically using everything from the cloud, but they still need to authenticate. Well, in that case, what you could do is through your conditional access policy, in this case, the IP address that you permit, you don't have to permit Canada-wide as a whole. And what you could do is only permit people to authenticate to the cloud using the IP from the office. So now you've really secured it down, because in order for you to access, their cloud, they have to be physically sitting at the office. Obviously, we would also, if we had Wi-Fi, well, we would password protect the Wi-Fi, obviously, but we can take that a step further where we can add other additional single IP addresses. If we, let's say, for example, the president of the company, he likes to work from home a couple of days a week. Well, in that conditional access policy, we can also add another IP address, and in this case, it would be the IP address provided by his internet service provider. So ideally, like I said before, we'll do that through conditional access, but ideally still requiring multi-factor authentication. And as a matter of fact, we can use conditional access policies to force MFA on all the users. Now, there are different ways to achieve multi-factor authentication. I know some people are still using it, the old per-user legacy MFA, that in 365 Admin Center, where you manage your users, you're able to enforce MFA on those users one by one. Now, you can do it that way. It's just that, it can lead to errors. You can forget to enforce it for some people, and then you end up, having an account that only requires a username and a password where we're not enforcing MFA. Now, we can do it through security defaults, which is to me a much better option than the per user legacy MFA. And security defaults is available for every tenant. It doesn't matter what 365 license you have provision in the tenant, security defaults can be enabled. But when you're using conditional access policies, you have to disable security defaults. They cannot coexist because what really happens in the background is when you enable security defaults, Microsoft actually configures a conditional access policy for you, but you can't see what the parameter is. You don't have access to it. So ideally, go with with a license that has Microsoft Entra ID P1, where we can then create and configure those conditional access policies, and we can customize them, for that customer's environment. And as well as I mentioned before, we'll also enable self-service password reset so that if a user suspects that their identity has been compromised, or they call it start having cold feet because they just realized that, man, I just used my username and password from work to create a login, and I don't think I should have done that, and rah rah rah. So, okay, so go and change your password for work. There's nothing wrong with being cautious. But we say convert zero trust access policy for identity and network. And we're going to see where that notion of network comes in. So at its base, conditional access, we can use it to protect the identity, but we can also protect it from the different endpoints that users are able to use to gain access, but we can also now control from which network we give them access. And that notion of network is now comes through this new service called Security Service Edge. So now Microsoft, with those conditional access policies, it gathers all these signals. Now, compliant network. Now, what does that mean? Is that the network that I want to give you access to? Has it been configured properly? Your location, we already talked about that. It could be from where you are. It could be a country. It could be a specific IP in question. The risk, where we talked about it through identity protection, but we'll see that a little bit later as we look at conditional access in more detail. A trusted and compliant device. We'll see how to create device compliant policies using Intune. We can even limit the apps and data. Now, whether your device is compliant or not, when you're using conditional access, I can decide that when you're using your desktop or your laptop, I will give you access to all the 365 apps. But I can also decide that if you're authenticating and you're wanting to gain access, and you're on your smartphone, I'm only going to give you access to email. So we're really able to create that granular approach and determine what it is that we want to make available for people, depending on how, when, and from what they're authenticating. And as well, identity, workload groups, and roles. That's where, like we mentioned before, relative to your identity, if you're part of a group, I can determine what access you're going to get as a group, but also depending on what role you have within the environment, within Entra ID, that will also give you access to certain functionalities. So I mentioned this a little bit before, where we're using AD Connect. Actually, it's called, formerly Azure AD Connect, pardon me. It is now known as Entra Connect. So this is where we'll synchronize those on-prem username and passwords to the cloud so that users only have a single username to authenticate, whether on-prem or whether in the cloud. And as well, when we do that, that's where we can use that benefit of password protection, because when we configure our sync between our on-prem Active Directory and the cloud in Entra, we'll activate password right back. So that way, when we're using password protection and a user goes in the cloud and changes their, let's say, their username and password, it's Saturday morning, the user is at home, they use the self-service password reset. they go and change their password. They put something that's not restricted through password protection. And then what happens is the system will do a password write back. So that new password will now get pushed down to the on-prem local Active Directory network. So Monday morning when they log in, on the Active Directory at the office, they will now be, able to use that same password that they had just changed on the weekend for their on their cloud access. Now, there are different methods to synchronizing user accounts. Now, the most popular one is a password hash synchronization. So what that does is it takes a copy of every username and passwords and it encrypts, it hashes that login and takes a copy of it and puts it in the cloud in Entra. So what happens in that case is that's the most ideal scenario because if for some reason your local Active Directory domain controller fails, now, obviously, people, if you have a local file server, by default, people are not going to be able to access it because, the local network is down. But at least people from the office will still be able to access cloud resources. And as well, people from home are able to access cloud resources. Now, the other one is called pass-through authentication or PTA. This one is used in cases where it is possible that you'll have some customers, and this does happen, that the customers, just don't want a copy of the password, even though it's hashed. They don't want a copy of it in the cloud. So what happens in that instance is when someone authenticates from the cloud, or to the cloud, I should say, their identity authentication request will be redirected on-prem to the local active domain controller. Now, the caveat with this one is, unfortunately, in order to gain access to my cloud services, my cloud apps and information, I need to be authenticated on-prem regardless. But if the on-prem server is down, then by default, I can't authenticate. But there is a way to configure a fallback so that even if the local Active Directory is down, we're able to still fall back on Entra and still gain access to um, cloud services and cloud data. The third one is a federated service. Now, this would be an instance where we would like to use um, an external identity management system. In other words, anyone trying to authenticate locally or from the cloud would be redirected to, let's say, a third party. So you would need to authenticate outside of Microsoft in this case. But that one requires a lot of hardware behind it to set up. There can be some reasons for doing that, but typically those are for larger customers and larger environments that have very, very specific needs. So like I said before, so what we do is we take these on-prem identities in our Active Directory, we use Entra Connect, and then we push them up to the cloud. And now we have a copy of those cloud identities. And whether I'm at home authenticating to the cloud, or in this case, if I have password hash when I'm on-prem, I authenticate, to the local server. I'm in the cloud. I'm at home. I authenticate to the cloud. Entra authenticates me, validates that I am who I am, gives me access to cloud resources. But this is where it gets interesting, where I was talking about that notion of a network before. There is a way now of using this cloud identity, once it's validated by Entra, to come down and access local resources. So how do we do that? Well, nothing changes. We still, create the same users and Entra ID for our employees. If we fall into that scenario, well, we still create guest accounts. We still, we'll still be diligent. We'll do due diligence to make sure that we only give people access to what they need. That just enough access to just in time, only at the time that they're required to have access to it. But this is where we have now that where we discern between private resources, internet resources, and Microsoft resources. So how do we do that? That's with that previous slide where I was saying that now with my Entra ID, So all authentication requests are pushed to Entra ID. And when I want to access, let's say I'm from home, and I want to access, a file on a file server internally, now I'm able to do that without the requirement of a VPN. So this can be very interesting if you have, and I've had some partners who, who were in this type of situation where, it was time to renew that firewall appliance on the customer's end, and they were debating, maybe there's another way to go that's a bit cheaper than spending, $20,000 on a firewall, and well, yeah, now there is another way around it so that I no longer need that firewall that's able to do VPN access. So I can just using the base, router given to me by my internet provider. What I do at that in that point in time is I just install a client on my domain controller and on my file servers, everywhere it is that I want to have access to, and those are connected to Entra ID. So what happens is when a user wants access to that resources, they first need to authenticate, and then, you know, um, obviously we'll see a little bit later. We have traffic profiles we configure accordingly. And once that happens, that user has been authenticated. He wants to access the resource. The secure channel is open because um, that agent is installed on that server. So then from that point on, from the cloud, I'm able to access those internal resources, I should say. The other one is interesting, the internet resources, and actually becomes very interesting again if, let's say, for example, you have a customer and they're ready to renew that firewall again. Now, not only can I monitor internet access, internet traffic for people that are at the office, but I can actually do it for people that are at home, which is something I couldn't do before. The only way to do that was if I would have gotten them to connect remotely to a computer on the inside and then navigate the web from that computer on the inside to the outside. Well, now with Microsoft Internet Access, Entra Internet Access, I can do the same thing. I can have people access the internet and I install that agent on their device, on their laptop or on their desktop that they're using. And I can actually monitor, I can actually control or limit some of the sites that they're accessing. So this is good for people on-prem or for people that are at home. And the third type of traffic, now these two here, Entra Internet Access and Entra Private Access, require additional licenses. But at the moment, this Microsoft traffic, which we can add that extra layer of security because in order for that user on that device to access those Microsoft resources, they need to have that little client on their device, on their laptop, or let's say, or desktop. And we add that verification mechanism. We add that inside of a conditional access, and this Microsoft traffic is already included inside of Entra IDP1, which also happens to be with the one that we need to do conditional access. So here's what the configuration window looks like. So as I mentioned before, we have that Microsoft traffic profile. So if we want to further secure access to traffic, so now not only do we validate the device, let's say using Intune, but in this case, we go a step further where you also need to have that client active on your device. Now, there is a way to prevent a user from deactivating the agent on their machine. But what happens is if they do, then they just no longer are able to navigate in this traffic profile. So if the user does that, yes, they can still access the web, but they won't be able to access Microsoft resources until they re-enable the client. Yes, I got someone asking, is this a pre-recorded session or is it live? This session is live, so but it will be available on our YouTube channel after. So these are the other two profiles, the private access profile, where we would want to, let's say from home, access, on-prem resources. And then this is where we would monitor that internet traffic, whether people are at home or on-prem. So here we can do web content filtering. We can limit, what they're able to navigate. So just, just a second. I've got someone who just pulled. Okay. Yeah, I've got someone asking a question. Are we able to do Entra ID access with Mac, iPhones, Androids, and a Chromebook? Yes, you're able to do that, obviously, because you can always you can install those 365 apps on those devices, and obviously you'll have to authenticate in order to gain access to them. Yeah, you're asking IT Cloud have access to a SOC solution? And no, we don't. And as well, it's not a SOC solution is not available for SMB at the moment from Microsoft. And the other question, the temporary access you're referring to is only for E5, isn't it? I'm not sure I understand that question, however. Oh, are you referring to the just-in-time, just enough access? That's privileged identity management that requires Entra ID P2. So yes, you can have that with an E5, but if you have, let's say, business standard or business premium, yes, you can always buy Entra ID P2 as an additional license to do privileged identity management. So this is where we were talking before about Entra ID protection. So this is where Microsoft monitors the dark web for any compromised user IDs. So and we'll see how we can use that through our conditional access policies, where then we have what's called this real-time risk, and we have that risk is broken down into two different categories. So here we have our users. So as we mentioned before, we'll have our users, they always need to authenticate, obviously, and it is possible that, we only allow them to do it from a certain location. But this notion of user and location, you can also think of it when you're activating security defaults, because I've had some partners, mention to me that, hey, I activated security defaults at my customers. And it seemed to work for the first 2 or 3 days, but now users are no longer prompted to enter MFA. Well, what happens at that point is Microsoft emits a verdict, so that they're seeing that it's always the same user from the same location wanting, to access the let's say the same tenant, the same data. So in their mind, they're emitting the verdict that yes, it is the same user. It's not someone new. So in that case, just to make the process easier, they're just not going to require MFA. And as well, what we can do is I mentioned before, in a case of global secure access, yeah, we would detect that little agent to install on it. But if we were not going down that route, then we can certainly determine, depending on what the device is. Like as I'm mentioning before, we could, say that if it's a smartphone, I'm not going to give you access to everything. I'm just going to give you access to email. But as well, what we can do are compliance policies in Intune, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So we can combine that device compliance policy in Intune. We can combine that to our access policy, and that the sense that if our device, doesn't meet compliance, is not compliant to what we've, require it to be, of what we consider it to be compliant, then it just doesn't have access to the resources. So as well, we can, determine which applications, we can limit the scope of your application. In all fairness, we'll see that though in session 2, but we could actually configure access for an application that might need to access data inside of our organization as well. But we'll talk about this real-time risk. So this is where identity protection comes into play. So when we use identity protection, then we have Microsoft that verifies those identities on the web. And every time they detect an identity that has been compromised, they'll report that. It gets indicated in our tenant so that when we have identity protection and we combine that with our conditional access policy, then we have this notion of risk. It's either a sign-in risk or a user risk. Now, what that means is it a typical sign-in risk, and I always give the the same example, is a sign-in risk will be what it's called the atypical filter. What that means is it's atypical in the sense that before we had the case where we have the always the same user logging in from the same location. So Microsoft decided not to require MFA. So if that same user moved to another location, then Microsoft, would more than likely enforce MFA. But that's for a case where the identity has not been detected as being compromised. So when we're using identity protection, and Microsoft has reported to us that that identity has been compromised, then in that case, we ourselves can then give the verdict that we want to provide access or to provide additional proof of who you are, or I can force you to change your password because I know that that's going to force you to answer those security questions. So when we enable the user risk or sign-in risk, we need to evaluate low, medium, and high. What do we consider as an allowable risk level of risk? And within that risk, um, if we choose to block access, then what mechanisms do we want to invoke? So as I was mentioning, so in sign-in risk, we'll have that atypical travel. So what that means is I've been detecting you for let's say the last 5 years. You're always authenticating from the same country. And all of a sudden today, I see you authenticating from another country. Well, and on top of that, Microsoft has reported to me that, your ID has been compromised. So I more than likely, definitely, MFA would have been invoked. But in this case, because I'm using identity protection, I know that identity has been compromised. I'm going to take it a step further and I'm going to, let's say, just block all access. I can choose to do that if I want, or I can force you to change your password. Or here, a user risk, that would be the impossible travel filter. That's the one where you just authenticated in Canada, and 5 minutes later, I see another authentication request. I don't know, let's say for Russia or China, knowing full well that no one can travel to and from those two countries in that amount of time. So, once again, we can decide in that case what to do. We can, in that case, a lot of the times we'll just simply block access. We'll just wait till the user calls, and that way we can validate verbally with that user where they are physically at that moment, and we'll I mean, at a minimum, definitely change that user's password. I see a question in the chat where it says Global Secure Access is not listed in the NCE SKUs. Global Access Secure is not a license, is not a SKU, it's a concept. Now the two licenses that I showed before that are part of that, the intra-internet access and intra-private access, those two licenses you will find as individual SKUs. All right. Continuous access evaluation. Now, this one is very interesting in that we can configure those for our users. And like if we start configuring, and I've had partners ask me this before, we'll configure conditional access policies, but I make a change in my conditional access policy, but I don't want to wait until the session token expires. In other words, I don't want to wait till the user logs in again. So I want to apply those new settings, that new enforcement right away. So in that case, I would check off in the session controls in the conditional access policy. I would enable continuous access evaluation, so that way I can force those new criterias, that new level of verification in my conditional access immediately for the users. Now we're going to look on in session number two. We're going to look at the Defender suite of products, but there is a way using Microsoft Entra ID to not only validate cloud-based IDs, but we're also able to extend that to other IDs. But we'll see that in session number two. Now, the idea here, like I mentioned before, with the Entra ID protection, as well as when we combine that with Defender for Identity, we can definitely elevate that level of protection. But we'll look at that in detail in session number two, and we'll also look at, what is XDR, or what does it take to be considered as being XDR. Next, we'll talk about identity governance. So you might have some customers that fall under this situation where, depending on the sector of activity that they're in, it could be for regulatory compliance, it could be for legal reasons or insurance reasons that they need to prove that they're doing identity governance. So what does that mean? That means that you need to be able to track the day that a user was created, what permissions they were given, when was that user's permissions or roles or privileges elevated or changed, when did the user leave, when was the user account revoked, and all that. So identity governance gives us that possibility where we're able to monitor those activities relating to user accounts, and we're also able to produce reports on that. Like I said, some customers will fall under that umbrella. I've had partners contact me, and ask for more explanation and how can they license that. So, like I said, it's really on a case by case basis. But I always say that even if you're not going to go the full route of doing ID governance, we're also going to see it in here. There's nothing wrong with manually doing your access reviews, because we should really be always preoccupied about leaving accounts open for people that are no longer with the organization, but the user account is still active. There's still a license associated to it, so technically that's an open door. Now, in some cases, where would we want to do identity governance? That's when you would link your environment, your Entra ID, to an HR platform. And I've seen this before, for automation purposes. So what happens is somebody is hired, then, as soon as they reach a certain step, in their onboarding or, throughout the interview process in the HR platform, they're, they're given authorization for their account to be created. But I've seen it before that it wasn't bi-directional, in the sense that yes, the user account got created, but sometimes IT still has to come and determine the level of access, or sometimes when they left the organization, the HR platform wasn't able to signal the system automatically, or in some cases, then we fall back on a manual notification. But once again, it does happen that people from HR don't always let IT know when people leave. So that's where we end up with these cases where we still have active user accounts, but those people have actually left the organization. So that's where it's still a good idea to do that manual access review periodically, because nothing prevents you from going in the 365 admin center and extract a list of users and validate with the customer, are these people still with the organization. Let's look at the role that they have. Do they need a different level of access? because it could be that for some reason, one of those individuals, was one of the IT admins and he still has, the global admin role associated to that account. And no one, he left, but no one has thought of changing the password yet on that account either. So, I mean, all sort of different situations happen. So, we should always, approach things and be more proactive than reactive. So what we were talking about before was this privileged identity management with limited time access or just enough access. So the idea behind that is we can set up a portal where users will actually request for their privileges to be elevated. And the beauty of that system is that it leaves a trail. And then it's not only the user having to access request, to request the access, pardon me, but the person who does the approval, also we can set it up that they have to justify it. You have to give a proper justification in order to why that you approve the elevation of privileges for that individual user. So that way we're able to go back in time and see who requested what and who did what, who approved it. So it's very handy in that ID governance approach once again. Well, this is not the full ID governance. This is a separate mechanism. But once again, it's also part of that notion of um, do people that have access to my resources, do they need to have access to them, and do they need to have the level of access that they have at the moment? Once again, it's that least privilege access. So on demand, just in time administrative access. In this case, that would be, if you have, let's say, and I always give the example, well, I'm the admin and I know so and so is leaving on vacation and, I need to give somebody else, access temporarily, but I forgot to leave a note in my calendar or heaven forbid it was actually a post-it, but you know what I mean. So typically what happens is we give someone more privileges, more access that they regularly need to have, and it's only on a limited time basis. It's also, we should always be proactive. It's also very important to remove that individual's access after they leave. But this mechanism permits us to do that, where we give that demand just in time with just enough access. Because the idea is, once again, is we'd never want to leave someone, with too much access for too long of a period of time that they weren't supposed to have it. Now, these are those access reviews I was talking about. Yes, we can do it. Actually, when you invoke PIM, you will actually get periodically reminders if you're one of the persons that is responsible for, authorizing and providing well, if you invoke justification, but if you're one of the ones that's responsible for approving those elevated privileges requests, you'll also be receiving an email where periodically it tells you, hey, it's time to come in. Can you, do your access reviews? Make sure that everyone who has access should still have access. And here's that ID governance dashboard. I find this one very interesting in the sense that it really, gives me a picture. In this case, 50 user accounts were recently created or deleted. Now, this could be very interesting if you know that well, that's kind of odd. We've only done 30 hires, in the past 2 or 3 months. Like, why do we have 50 user accounts that were recently created? Or why does it say that they could have been deleted as well? So it sort of gives you a heads up. So, once again, part of our daily management that, we will go through is go and examine the dashboard to see what is happening. Once they have 23 business apps with direct user assignments, because I was mentioning before, we can actually give an application access to resources. And here we have 40 guest users in our directory. Well, if I'm in the process of wanting to eliminate guest access, well, in this case, this is a good way to keep tabs on it to make sure that, things are getting done, that access is being removed. And here I see 17 users with active privilege role assignment. So that's typically, a privileged more or over and above, the regular privilege that a regular user should have. All right, so let's look at Intune. So Intune is our device management, and I know some partners tell me this. They'll say, yeah, but when I go in Intune, it says it's for mobile devices because it says MDM, mobile device management. But the truth is, it's not just for mobile device management. It's for your desktops and your laptops as well. Because what we have to understand is that at the time that iTunes came to be, it was a solution, a cloud-based solution to address mobile devices because we already had, for at least for those who had their on-prem servers, were either using GPOs or configuration manager. But it also gave people a chance because we figured, mobile devices are just that. They're mobile. They could be lost. They could be accessed by other people that perhaps maybe shouldn't access them. So that's why it came out that way. But ideally, no, it's not just for the mobile devices, it's for all devices. And it's that single pane for management of our devices. Now integrated value because once again, it's part of that Microsoft ecosystem. And as I mentioned before, we'll use Intune for those compliance policies, which we link to our conditional access policies. So it's really that central tool that anything that it's sort of the identity of the device, if you want, or what the device, should have as far as applications, because we'll use to develop application profiles. So we'll determine which applications we want on our devices and we want users to be using. We can even do zero touch deployment. We can use what's called the out of the box experience. So, basically, anyone could actually technically buy any device and we can actually deploy it remotely. It never really has to fall within the hands of anyone from the IT department. But we can do those drop shipments, or we can, if you deal with big suppliers, what they'll do is you can request, let's say you buy 20, 30, 50 laptops or desktops, you can have them say, hey, can you drop all those serial numbers in my tenant or in that customer's tenant? Because I plan on using Autopilot for my deployment. So they're able to do that for you. That way, it really automates that process where no one has to physically, manually handle. We just do a drop ship uh, to the person that's supposed to be receiving that device. They turn it on, they authenticate with their 365 ID, and boom, the device itself gets prepped for them. So it's really built to manage our modern environment in the sense that, years ago or when we were just on-prem, we never thought of doing this out of the box thing where, I would send a laptop or I would ship a laptop or I would even have someone go and themselves and buy a laptop and then I could just remotely deploy whatever it is that I wanted to be deployed on that device. So that's why we call it a cross-platform endpoint management. We'll see a little bit in the next slide which platforms it actually supports. So endpoint security built in, because we actually were able to enable those compliance policies. So we're able to determine, we can control and push security updates. We can determine the frequency of those. We can determine that compliance. But we also use it to when we're using Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business, when we want to increase that default consumer type antivirus that comes with Windows, when we want to go with an enterprise grade, at that moment we'll use Intune to push all our security policies. So our firewall policies, our next generation protection policies, our attack surface reduction policies, we can push all of that using Intune to our devices. And yes, it is for mobile application management as well. We'll have a little slide on that where we'll show a case where it's a BYOD, it's personal user's device, but we're able to manage the applications on that device and the behavior of those applications. Device compliance, we've already talked about, and we get to endpoint analytics. So, we're able to get a view of what's going on the device. And as well, we'll see yeah, that we'll see in a couple slides. We'll see as well that we're actually able to, for analytics purposes, we're actually able to integrate Intune with other systems. And it's also neat because we no longer we can we can control just the device if we want, but we can actually control for the same device. We can give a different experience depending on who the user is that's using the device. So that's all possible as well with Intune. So here we see that, yes, it's for desktop. It's not just for mobile, but we're able to manage Windows devices. We're able to manage Mac OS devices, so iMacs, MacBooks, and we're also able to deal with iPads, iOS. We're also able to manage Android devices and as well as Linux devices. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So we're not only able to manage corporately owned devices, but we can also manage BYOD devices, users' devices that would accessing or be using corporate apps or that would have corporate data on them. And of course, by default, it's cloud managed, but it can be co-managed. And so what does that mean? We can actually use that in combination with GPOs, or we can actually use it in combination with Configuration Manager. We could even go as far as if we don't want to do co-manage. Let's say my client is in the process of getting rid of their on-prem infrastructure. They're going to get rid of that file server, and we're going to eliminate the Active Directory controller. So I don't want to be using GPOs, but I was. Well, we can actually migrate, take a copy of those GPOs, bring them into Intune, and from that point on, we can manage pretty much the same way those devices that we were doing it when we were doing it through GPOs. So it's really flexible in that approach that we can choose to still have that two-prong approach, or we can just simply decide to only use the cloud managed approach. Well, let's look at a little scenario where we have the Northwind Traders marketing manager. She's using her personal device to check company email, but she also receives, a confidential business plan, and she just happened to accidentally save it, to her personal share, which is not secure for later reference. Well, if we had managed that device through Intune, we could actually have prevented her from saving that piece of corporate data anywhere but outside of a corporate silo, let's say corporate storage area. So in this case, we could have made sure that she saved it to OneDrive. She would not have been able to have saved it to Dropbox. And we can even go a step further than that is if we suspect anything on the device, or let's say she leaves the company, obviously the first thing we'll do is we'll block her account, we'll remove her account. Minimally we'll remove the license, but unfortunately I've seen it in some cases that people still need to access that user's email or that user's OneDrive. So what they'll do is they'll leave the account active, but they'll change the password. But unfortunately, what is still on the device is still on the device. So what we can do in that case with Intune is we can actually go and wipe those corporate apps as well as all the corporate data that's contained in those corporate apps. So it really gives us that flexibility, to address situations like that where these are not corporate devices, so we don't have full control over them. Because if this had been a corporate device, once again, I mean, it will happen. Devices will get lost. Employees will leave the organization. Employees will not return their devices. In that case, what we can do with a corporate device is we can do a full device wipe. We can just, do a factory reset on it if we, if the person just, um, ends up not returning the device or if the device actually does get lost. So this is where we're talking about iTunes integration. So obviously we already talked a little bit about that before, where we integrate Entra with Intune through the use of those compliance policies. We can actually use Intune to determine that compliance. And what does a compliance policy look like? Well, I can decide what is compliant in my eyes. So I can say that your device needs to be compliant, and to me, compliance means you need to be using, a certain minimum version of Windows. So I will determine you need to be using version 10.x.x.x. You need to have your antivirus up and running. You need to have the firewall up and running. So I can make sure at a minimal, and there are many other criterias that I can set in my compliance policies, but those are just three quick ones that are easy to comprehend. So I can decide what is compliant in my eyes, and I tie that to my conditional access policy. So if a user tries to access a device through a conditional access policy and they're not using a device that's compliant, well, in that case, I can refuse access, or I can limit access, just like before. My other example where was that, I choose to limit access, because I don't have corporate mobile devices. People are only using BYOD, and people don't want to, don't want to install the corporate apps. Well, guess what? I'm not going to give you, access to email at all. So I can choose to, to do that myself through those conditional access, but it's even more powerful when I link it to a compliance policy. Now, I mentioned before that we can use Defender. Like I said before, we actually use in combination Intune and Defender. So we can create those security policies when we're using Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business, when we want to elevate the antivirus that we're using on our endpoints. And we'll see Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Business. We'll see that in more detail in session 2. But I just wanted to, since we're on the Intune side of things, to say that we're actually using Intune, like I said before, to create and deploy those firewall policies. We can use that to establish our attack surface reduction policies, and we then push those to the devices. We can as well use Sentinel. So what we can do with Sentinel is we can have Sentinel pull signals from Intune and pull signals from Defender as well if we want. Um, Sentinel still, is one of those tools that's used by bigger organizations because of, the costs involved. But it is possible that, and we'll see that as well in session 2, that there are other ways, other methods to pull information using APIs as well. Someone's asking, can we push the data to something other than Sentinel? Yes. Well, I'm going to get ahead of myself. Yes, in Defender, and it's actually not a push that you do, but it's a pull. So from another platform, you could connect that to Defender using an API, and you could choose to extract those signals in order to analyze them, in a third-party external platform. But we'll talk a lot more in detail about that in session 2. And we're able to as well combine Purview and Intune, where we can, when we're using Intune and information protection, if we set up a data loss prevention policies, then in that case, we're able to invoke an endpoint DLP where we could prevent someone from using, the USB port, or we could even know, we do have protection on files. We would still like to prevent people from simply being able to copy files on a USB through a USB port. As well, just before we finish, we'll take a couple of minutes. And when we say no better time, it truly is no better time because it's also NCE renewal time. So Microsoft has made available to customers and to us these promos as well. This one on Business Premium, till April 1st, customers that are new to Business Premium can have a 15% discount on the acquisition of those licenses. So now is really, really a good time to have that security discussion with customers that are not using Business Premium because they're able to move up to Business Premium, but at a 15% rebate. So once again, typically Business Premium will be for those customers that have 300 seats or less. And that obviously, like I mentioned, are not using Business Premium or only using, like Stay Exchange Online protection for email. In that case, they're not using information protection, so there's no encryption of content. You're not able to do data loss prevention, data retention policies, data suppression policies. We're not able to do conditional access. We're not able to use Intune. So, there are really many, many benefits to using Business Premium, in order to up the ante on security for those, customers that are only, let's say, for example, using Business Basic or Business Standard. Now, when we have customers that have tenants or that have more than 300 users, then we talk about Microsoft 365 E3. Well, 365 E3 is also, has a promotion tied to it. That one, though, doesn't end April 1st like the one for Business Premium. It ends June 30th. So once again, those customers that, and this, when we say new, it could be an existing customer that is just not using that license, or it could truly be a new customer to Microsoft. It could be someone coming from a competing cloud platform. So, and as well, we have Microsoft 365 E5. So once again, if you fall into that scenario where you have customers that have Microsoft 365 E3, and I've even seen in some cases, where customers have done the jump from Business Premium right up to 365 E5, because Microsoft 365 E5 is that license that has the most security features, at the highest level. Everything comes in premium plan too. So you definitely get all the benefits and all the functionality of every solution that's linked to that SKU. And as well, Microsoft 365 Copilot. Originally, that promotion was set to end in December, but Microsoft extended it. So now it extends to April 1st. And guess what? It actually coincides with Business Premium. So once again, good time. Customers thinking of getting on board with Microsoft 365 Copilot, and we're thinking, we'd maybe we'd like to make things a little more secure before we bring Microsoft 365 Copilot into the mix. We'd like to log down the identities, through conditional access. We'll definitely do MFA. We'd like to maybe think about, data loss prevention. I don't necessarily want people to use Copilot to extract information and then email it to exfiltrate it out. We'll use information protection. We'll do some data loss prevention policies. So, it's really a good time to have that security discussion with customers. But honestly, whether they're thinking of going with Microsoft 365 Copilot or not, it's always a good idea to increase your security posture. And as well, Copilot, since December, is now available on a monthly billing schedule. So it is still only available on a yearly license, on a yearly engagement contract, but you can now pay for it monthly. So customers don't have to fork out the whole amount for the whole year for Microsoft 365 Copilot. And as well as you are resellers of Microsoft products through Microsoft's partner benefits packages, you are now entitled to have access to a free Microsoft 365 Copilot. Now, that benefits package program is built on, it works on a system of points. So you need to achieve a certain number of points before you get, let's say, your first license. If you achieve more points, then you get access to more licenses. So depending on your solution designation, depending on your level of certification, depending on how many employees you have that are certified. So that all permits you to accumulate, so many points. And once you reach a certain level, that's when you start, being able to be given access to those free Microsoft 365 Copilot licenses. So as I mentioned before, I work in the security team, pre-sales security team here at IT Cloud. So anytime you want to talk security with me, let's say, for example, you won't be able to attend session two of the Security Excellence Program, but you would definitely like to talk, about what it is that you're not going to be able to see. But you would also like to talk about what it is that you did see today, or you would like to talk about a specific situation or scenario that you have with a client, or how do I approach my client, how do I have that security discussion with the client, then certainly we can sit down and have that discussion. So either scan the QR code or take down the URL that's on the slide. So that will bring you to our specialists bookings link. And in my case, since I take care of security, choose the Microsoft 365 security tile, pick a date and time that is convenient to you, and we'll meet together and we'll certainly have that security discussion. So on that note, before I go just a little bit further, I'd like to thank you. So if you have any other questions, like I said before, or you would like to talk to your account rep, or you have a general question, you can always contact IT Cloud, do option 6, or email partners at IT Cloud, and we'll certainly be able to give you a hand. So what we saw today in session one, so we took a quick look at that threat landscape where the most prevalent attacks are identity related and ransomware, and it seems ransomware is going down a little bit, but we'll see. It could be that some of these big, large threat actors, were taken down by different governments. So I mean, that could influence, temporarily that picture, but definitely, identity, credential harvesting or identity theft, for email passwords and users for actually username and passwords for users, are on the rise, definitely. I know we talked about identity and access management. So we focused a lot on Entra because there's so many things, there's so many ways now to leverage Entra and to use Entra, to not only to protect those identities, but once you're using the identity to control and authorize, how you're able to access and what you're able to access. As well, we talked about device management and Intune, but and we'll come back a little bit on some of these two subjects in the next one, because in session two we're going to focus on data protection. Now that'll be done through the use of information protection and Purview. And as well, we'll look at the Defender suite of solutions, and there are many, and definitely each one of them is there to address a need. But the beauty of it is all those security signals are all collected in one console, are all analyzed, and we get that single pane of glass. We get that complete picture in one place. And definitely, what we'll do at the end of session two is we'll talk about the next step is, for those of you that are not selling much security or you're not comfortable in selling security, and then definitely, I will propose something to you that could help you in that. And we can discuss it one-on-one as well. But at the end of that session, I'll suggest to you a program where, you would get assistance directly from Microsoft on how to carry out those discussions, how to carry out those presentations, and as well some of the incentives that are linked to that go directly to you. So we can certainly look at that at the end of session two. So on that note, that does it for me. So I thank you very much for being with me today. Thank you for letting us IT Cloud take 2 hours of your precious time. I know we all, it's a limited resource, but we really, really do thank you for you know, um, seizing on the opportunity, me making the effort for being with us, and we are really, really grateful for that.